You guys know that my dad works for a bank, right? Well, when I was 6, he got promoted and the bank sent him to go set up a new branch out on the north coast of Wales, in a small town maybe 3 or 4 miles to the east of Bangor, just across the Strait of Anglesey. When I heard that we were going to go out there and live in a whole new town for a year, I guess I was pretty excited. I was at that age where I loved making friends and going to people's houses, but I hadn't quite forged friendships strong enough that I'd feel sad about leaving them. I remember how full of anticipation I was when we first got underway. With the help, no doubt, of a quick nap along the way, I reacted with the appropriate wonder as we wound our way into Snowdonia. It was spring and the melting snows were flowing down into silver rivers on the floors of the valleys. I still remember how vibrant and new the trees were. As we neared the end of our path, though, everything changed. Caer Bethel was a dingy little town, and the dullness of the place had even seemed to leach into the landscape around it. The forest gave way to bare, grassy hills that were nearly bald due to the constant winds coming off the Irish Sea. Heading into town, we saw more and more evidence that, somewhere along the line, things had gone south. The overwhelming impression I got was grey. Grey houses topped with grey slate on grey roads that led towards grey rocks and a sterile grey sea. In the outskirts, I don't know how many for sale signs I saw, but even a child like me could see that no one wanted to stay here, and, more importantly, no one wanted to move here. My dad, still feigning excitement and happiness, decided not to head straight to the house the bank was renting for us, and instead to take us on a quick tour through the town centre. The closest thing I can think of to describe it is how high streets looked after the recession. Dozens of empty spaces with whitewashed windows and yet more estate agent signs. Dad cheerily pointed through the windscreen at a disused Burger King, sign still up, and said, "Look, Jemima, that's where Daddy's bank is going to be. Isn't that neat?" I'm still a little sad at how disappointed he looked at the half-hearted ooh that I gave in response. We moved in the Easter holiday, and within a week, school started. More grey, slate-roof buildings and grey head teachers. I even think the school tie might have been grey, I'm not sure though. I'll dig up a school photo next time I'm at my house. Anyway, there was only one school in Caer Bethel, the David Llewellyn Anglican School. My parents weren't hugely religious, but they were, at least nominally, Church of England. Besides, the only other school available was a half-hour drive away, whereas this one was walking distance from our semi-detached house. I quickly discovered that, despite the supposedly strict enforcement of school rules that the staff proudly promoted, and the Christian values handed down to us in lectures longer than the Sermon on the Mount, bullying was common, both on the playground and in the classroom. One kid in particular, Paul, got it the worst. He was a little short and dumpy and wore thick glasses that were often clouded with sweat. He cried at the slightest hint that someone was angry at him, and, believe me, people were angry at him a lot. I guess it wasn't really his fault, he was just one of those children that kids naturally hate. I remember the day I befriended him. Paul had this little book of dinosaurs that he adored, even though it still had the 30p sticker from the Cancer Research charity shop. In the mornings, before our English lessons, he'd sit on his own at a table in the corner of the room during registration, muttering the words over and over as if trying to memorise them. Stegosaurus, Tyrannosaurus, Megalosaurus, Stegosaurus, Tyrannosaurus, Megalosaurus. One morning, this girl in our class, her name was Bethany Evans, maybe Alice Evans. She was obviously bored. She stood up, bold as brass, and glanced to check that Miss Thomas, the greying widow who taught us English, was busy with paperwork. She walked over to Paul's table and snatched the book out of his hands. Already, tears began to prick in his eyes, magnified by the milk bottle glasses. "This book is for babies. Why do you keep reading these baby books?" she spat in his face. He tried to speak, but I guess he was too shocked by the sudden aggression of it to form words. Seeing weakness, she doubled down. She called him a big dum-dum and asked again why he read baby books. "I just like the pictures," he bawled, his words coming out in thick sobs. Of course, I thought myself quite the heroic little 6-year-old, so I stood up and walked over to her, trying to grab the book. "Leave him alone, Bethany," I said. "Let him read what he wants." She replied with a voice dripping with scorn, telling me to go away, that it was nothing to do with me. I was close to yelling at her, to give the book back to Paul. A smirk formed on her face. She told me, "Go away, or you won't be invited to Gwyneth Jones' birthday party." I froze. Gwyneth Jones' birthday was a big deal, even for us kids. Her parents had rented out a pizza place over in Bangor, where it was rumoured you could get free refills on drinks, a concept that was new and exciting to me. Still, I only froze for a second before snatching the book from her hand. It came away with a rip, and one page, a full-colour image of a T-Rex having a battle with a flying lizard, fell slowly to the floor. Paul let out a fresh bout of tears. "Bethany," I hissed, wary of catching Mrs. Thomas' attention. "You're such a bat." She gasped, genuine shock in her face. You swore at me. I'm going to tell." I told her that if she told on me, I'd tell that she ripped Paul's book. She stormed away and sat next to Gwyneth, her pigtails bouncing with rage. Calmly, I picked up the torn page, slotted it into the book, and handed it back to Paul. To cut a long story short, we became friends quickly. I enjoyed having someone who needed me, and I think he just enjoyed having someone who would put up with him and keep him safe in the playground. I became sort of an outcast, but I knew I'd only be there for a year, and I wasn't exactly a socialite. I think the only reason I'd even been invited to Gwyneth Jones' birthday party was because her mum had told her not to be mean to the new kid. As Paul opened up to me, I learned that he wasn't just interested in dinosaurs. Frogs, fish and flies, if it moved, he loved it. He impressed me on several occasions by identifying bugs from metres away and carefully shepherding them to safety. After a few weeks, I went to Paul's house. He lived in a small mining cottage on the inland side of Cairn, a half-mile up the road actually from my dad's workplace. I was welcomed in by Paul's mother, a quiet, reserved woman who dressed in pastel shades and had her prematurely grey hair in a ponytail. It wasn't until Paul and I were alone in the playroom, a converted child's bedroom, that I noticed what was strange. Whenever there was a brief rare pause in his chatter about the animal toys he had, and what precisely the Brachiosaurus ate, there was just that, a pause. Silence. It took me a couple of minutes to realise what was going on, but I realised that I was so used to the radio always being on, or the constant outpour of the TV, that the complete quiet, save for distant, ambient noises, was unnerving. The true implications of the silence didn't hit me until the penultimate week of school of that year, 2005. My parents had close friends in London, and when we left the house to walk to school that morning, the news was still trickling through about the 7/7 attacks, and my parents were naturally worried. I didn't quite understand what was going on, of course, but that look in my parents' faces that they couldn't quite disguise really left its mark on me. I was quiet all morning, and there was little in the way of lively conversation among the other kids. Apart from Paul, that is. All day he kept trying to spark up chats with me as if he didn't realise that anything was wrong. I finally snapped and told him that there had been a terrorist attack and that I was scared. His reply was, "What's a terrorist?" Paul's parents didn't let him see much of the dangers of the outside world. The only news in his house was the Daily Mail that his dad bought every other day, which Paul obviously had little interest in. Of course, I wasn't in the mood to recognise this. Perhaps unfairly, I got angry at him, told him that he was a big idiot and that he should go away. I didn't see him at all those next 2 weeks as school finished up. Even at the end-of-year assembly, which I gathered was a big thing for the locals, he didn't show up. I asked Mrs. Thomas where Paul was and she told me he was ill, but I knew he was faking. Just when I'd begun to think we weren't friends anymore, Paul did what Paul did best, surprise and annoy me. On the first day of the summer holiday, a day I'd earmarked for watching trashy cartoons and staying up late, aka 8 p.m, Paul showed up at my house excited and told me that he wanted to go bird watching. This was a new departure for him. He'd shown an interest in most animals, but he'd never seemed all that keen on birds. Still, glad to have him back, I followed, letting him chatter as we walked up the grass hill at the back of town, and he noted down every bird we saw in his little green notebook. I asked him what got him into birdwatching, and he grinned, telling me that his mum got him a CD of bird songs and a book from the charity shop. He asked me if I wanted to have a look later on. Later that day, he played me the CD in the playroom, while showing me pictures of all the British birds in the book. The book was nice enough, a little worn, and someone had ticked in blue biro which birds they'd spotted. But the calls, I don't know, they're a little unnerving. Cut in with some of the bird recordings were samples of lower quality, which sounded like an impression of the birds. Still, Paul hadn't noticed, and I didn't want to risk offending him by pointing it out. Out of the blue, he asked me to come with him on Sunday morning to do some early morning bird watching. I was reluctant. "Don't you have church tomorrow?" I asked. I didn't really want to be dragged out on the weekend when I could have been watching SpongeBob repeats for hours on end. "Yeah, but before then," he replied. He said that the best time to see birds was before dawn, according to the book. He showed me the passage circled in blue biro. "Dawn, no way, that's too early," I told him. I wanted to lie in. He kept asking though, and eventually I relented. I didn't want to risk losing him for another 2 weeks. When we met outside my house the next morning, Cair Bethel had never looked so pretty. A storm had swept through overnight, and the clouds, already breaking up, towered into the sky for miles. They were highlighted pink and amber by the sun just over the horizon. We saw no one, save for a couple of tramps in the dark corners of town and a few fishermen on their way to the town's small harbour. Just as eager at 5 a.m. as ever, Paul led me through the town, past the school, past the Quaker church, past the high street with its blind boarded-up windows, chatting merrily as if unaware of the sleeping town. It may be that I'm looking back on this with 20/20 hindsight, but I could swear that even then I felt wary, and, as cliché as it sounds, I felt almost like I was being watched by some unseen predator. Finally, we arrived at the place where Paul had been leading me, and my heart sank. "Paul," I said, "my mum doesn't want me to go there. She says it's dangerous." Stretching out ahead of us, across the stinking low-tide mud flats of the strait, was the pier. Once, back when Caer Bethel had almost lived up to the Victorian plan to be a seaside resort, the beer had been pleasant enough. Now, though, the cluster of salt-rotted buildings played host to a group of squatters. Out at the very tip, the ruined remains of the old arcade still stood, a burned-out husk following the decades-old arson. "Why?" Paul asked, curiosity on his face. He didn't see what could be dangerous about it. I was amazed at how oblivious he was, and, trying to phrase it in a way that he'd understand, replied, "There are bad people who live on the pier, Paul." I told him we should go home. "No," he yelled petulantly. "I want to see the birds. I want to see the birds." He dashed off onto the pier, and, sighing, I followed. I caught up with him when he pressed himself against the bars to poke his binoculars through. "Here," Paul said, thrusting the little green notebook at me along with one of those four-colour pens. He told me to note down the names of the bird as he said them aloud. He started listing birds, glancing at his book to check. I interrupted him, saying that it wasn't safe and that we should go. Suddenly, he shushed me, cutting me off. Even though I was getting angry, I paused. There was a noise coming from near the end of the pier. I don't know if either of you guys have heard a curlew before. They do this weird down-swoop tone over and over. That isn't exactly what we heard that day, though. What we heard was an imitation, kind of like a guy falsettoing. Paul told me he really wanted to see a curlew and beckoned me forward. He didn't seem to realise it was just an imitation. He ran towards the sound, towards the charred remains of the arcade, but I was too scared to follow. As he disappeared behind the blackened walls, I stood there, frozen in place, a shout rising in my throat to tell Paul to come back, to tell him that it wasn't right, that we needed to get out of there. But it was too late. When I heard him scream, I dropped the notebook and the pen and sprinted back to my house, crying all the way. I slipped back into the house and, holding back tears, quietly crawled into bed. I didn't mention Paul to my parents. A couple of days later, though, my mum sat me down and gave me a talk. Standard don't talk to strangers stuff. Almost as an afterthought, she mentioned that Paul had been involved in something. I remember her using that word, something, that he'd been involved in something, which meant that I probably wouldn't see him much anymore. When I returned to school in September, Paul wasn't there. No one missed him much, but I dutifully asked around, trying to find out where he'd gone, and I was eventually told that he and his family had moved away. I've never learned what happened, but every night for the last 12 years, I've dreamed the possibilities. I imagine walking down the pier, past the arcade, and watching as something peels off from the walls of the building, a charred shell of a man who endlessly torments me in fresh, horrible ways. The dream varies, but one thing always remains: the lilting, sorrowful cry of a curlew.